We're very fortunate today to be joined by Corey Callaghan. Corey is an assistant professor in the Department of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation at the University of Florida. His research focuses on leveraging big data, often contributed through citizen science initiatives, to understand biodiversity in space and time, with an emphasis on how biodiversity responds to anthropogenic habitat modification and how citizen science data can be used in practice. We're very excited and fortunate to have him with us today, and I'm going to turn it over to you now, Corey.
Thank you, Rebecca and Cassandra, for organizing. I appreciate y'all setting this up. So today I'm going to talk about using citizen science in biodiversity research and policy, a aptly broad title. As Rebecca mentioned, I am an assistant professor at the University of Florida within the Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. And within the Department of Wildlife, Ecology, and Conservation, I run what I call the Global Ecology Research Group because we work across many different taxa, across many different realms and across the world in general. And the reason for that is we rely heavily on citizen science data and kind of thinking about how citizen science data can be used. So that's my job. In my free time, I spend probably too much time on iNaturalist. I get very excited about naturalisting, bioblitzing, trying to see how many observations and species I can find. I spend a fair bit of time making identifications, mostly of birds. And yeah, so I'm very lucky that my job and my personal and professional life overlap immensely. And this is my website. You're welcome to check it out. I have a unique position in that I have a research and extension faculty position. And what that means is that for my research and my extension, they both rely on citizen science. My research kind of uses the data to produce scientific publications and understand the field of citizen science, develop models and quantitative approaches to understand biodiversity in space and time. But then on the other side of the coin is kind of developing workshops and outreach material that allows for engaged community engagement and kind of making better observations, making observations in different places that all leads to kind of better data and more data that we can answer more scientific questions with. And then in theory, in my utopian world, a lot of this leads to increased conservation and policy outcomes, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today. So first, what is citizen science? I now realize this is the citizen science webinar series, so maybe this was a poor starting point, but I'll give my take of it. Also commonly referred to as participatory science or community science. I tend to use those terms fairly interchangeably, but in my definition, it involves public engagement, education, data collection, and they're inherently interdisciplinary because they involve those different items, and they kind of tend to result in scientific advancement. eBird and iNaturalist are two programs that I work with the data a lot and I contribute to a lot as well personally. And often we use GBIF, which is the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, where a lot of this data ends up getting sucked up into. The whole field of citizen science is a growing field. This paper is a little bit outdated now, but you can see this literature review where Black is the citizen science term and it absolutely take off in the literature. Corresponding fairly well with an uptake in an availability of smartphone technology, which has made citizen science more popular and accessible across many different fields. And all of this in the literature translates to big data. So there's been a 12-fold increase in data within GBIF since 2007. And so that's just like massive mobilization of data. But what's important is that greater than 80% of those data since 2010 have been contributed by citizen science projects. And again, eBird and iNaturalist are just two of those, but those are the volume-wise, they tend to contribute the most. And so we have lots and lots of data. I think a lot of people, and myself included, tend to think of the data here and like, how do we use this biodiversity data now to answer ecological questions? I will say I'm trying to push myself more and more to think about how will we use these data in 10, 20, 30 years, right? Like even if the contribution patterns level off, we're still talking about hundreds of millions of observations a year. And how are we going to use those data meaningfully for biodiversity research and conservation? So the first thing that we did was part of my research group, we're looking at how are citizen science data being used. It's used to inform published papers and to inform policy. but these are rarely summarized and kind of looked at from a meta perspective and kind of quantifying from a broad scale how these data are being used. Ooh. And so I kind of split this up for the purposes of this talk into two components, research and then policy. And so for research, this is obviously very broad still, but different locations, species, analysis types, and data role of iNaturalists in the scientific literature. And then policy is the frequency and use of citizen science in policy relevant documents. So I'll start with this peer-reviewed literature scoping that my group recently did. This is currently under review, and so this is still a work in progress. So this was a collaborative effort of 14 researchers from around the world. We searched the peer-reviewed literature using the term iNaturalist on Web of Science, Scopus, Google Scholar, and we had over 1,000 different hits in Google Scholar alone, and we filtered that down. And our inclusion criteria included written in English or Spanish. The paper used iNaturalist data at some level, or at least deeply discussed the platform and the potential of the platform. It had to be peer-reviewed, scientific article. We purposefully did not include a lot of gray literature. And it was accessible, it had to be accessible to us in order to be included. So our search produced over 1,000 articles, of which over 2,500 met these search criteria. And this is a word cloud of those 2,500 plus articles, where the size of the word is directly corresponds to the number of times that it appeared in the title. So you can just quickly kind of see where and how these papers are being used to advance biodiversity research. Distribution is the largest one, climate change, conservation, um, Coleoptera, citizen science, diversity, range, a lot of new range expansions. All of these words commonly occurred in a lot of these titles of these 2,500 different articles. And so here you can see the number of articles through time. So we looked at the number of iNaturalist articles and years on the x-axis. You can see this just kind of crazy uptake in the number of research articles that are using iNaturalist and publishing using these types of data in some way, shape, or form. So A is just iNaturalist in our approach. B, we kind of tested this with GBIF articles that use iNaturalist to some level. That was challenging because when you cite the GBIF DOI, we weren't sure, well, that's the data we used, we weren't entirely sure to what extent iNaturalist was being used. And so this was done much more quantitatively, which this was done manually tagging all those 2,500 articles. But regardless of the approach, the number of peer-reviewed articles is directly corresponding to the kind of same trend of iNaturalist observations. So this is just the number of iNaturalist observations in millions through time. And you can just see the same pattern. As the number of iNaturalist observations is increasing, so too is the number of peer-reviewed research that is using those data. And here is the geographic spread of those articles. You can see, there was over 180 countries that used iNaturalist data to publish a peer-reviewed article, as in the location of the study was in at least 180 different countries. Far and away, the US is kind of the outlier here in terms of the number of articles, with some biases towards Australia, Europe, and the global north in general. But still, just to see the kind of vast usage of these data across the world was really, really cool. And here's a little bit more on the geographic representation in the literature. And so here, each country is the residual difference between the number of papers that are being published and the number of iNaturalist observations. So warm colors means underrepresentation of articles in the literature compared to the proportion of iNaturalist observations. And cool colors means an overrepresentation of articles in the literature compared to the proportion of iNaturalist observations. So you can see in some parts of the world where there's relatively few iNaturalist observations, you're actually getting an overrepresentation because those data are so important and valuable to understanding and advancing biodiversity research. Here's the breakdown of articles that use iNaturalist data based on kingdom and class. And far and away, Animalia had the most number of peer-reviewed articles, with Insecta, Reptilia, Aves, Mammalia, and then down to some of the ones that I'm not even sure of. And then for plants, Magnoliopsida and Liliopsida had the highest number of peer-reviewed articles. Here's another kind of look at this over and under representation idea. And so here's the relationship between the number of iNaturalist observations and the number of peer-reviewed articles based on class name and kingdom. And so you can see anything above this line is an overrepresentation. So that means that given the number of iNaturalist observations for mammalia, you're actually seeing per unit more research articles published using mammalia than other groups. And as I kind of mentioned with the word cloud, so for each article that we went through, we tagged manually like how these data were being used in the paper. Most of the articles are looking at species distribution or range, right? So very simply, a lot of range expansion articles, like this is the first record for Florida, this is the first record for the US, all over the place, or species distribution changing through time, and or species distribution modeling. And then a fairly distant second was like kind of biology and behavior, and then biodiversity or a population assessment. And then here's the different types of analyses. So species distribution, meaning actual species distribution modeling at some, at a broad definition, versus descriptive, just using it as in kind of here's the first record for this county or this state. That would be classified as descriptive. And then image analysis, population measure, other, or like a review of the iNaturalist data. And then lastly, this is something that is foreshadowing to something I'm going to talk about in a second, but the proportion of imagery analysis over time. So here's a photo that I took of this orange spotted flower moth, but that actually contains additional information that people are using to understand the interaction between that orange spotted flower moth and the flower. And so you can see through time that the proportion of articles that are using this imagery and doing something not with the spatiotemporal coordinates, but the images themselves is actually reaching almost 25% of the papers. All right, so that's a bit of a broad overview of a project that is currently ongoing in my research group. And since I was talking to NOAA, I thought it was a good opportunity to at least put some marine level things into this presentation. So insert this slide for a bit of a digression. So iNaturalist is something that I've worked on, and I've used these data to varying degrees. But then Reef Life Survey, which I'm sure a lot of you guys or folks are probably pretty familiar with. Comparing and contrasting the two, iNaturalist, anybody can make an account, anybody can upload an observation at any point in time, and there's no real structure to it, right? But Reef Life Survey is very structured, very high bar to be able to contribute data. The spatiotemporal contribution patterns are already set in many cases of where and when the sampling will take place. So these are two very different sets of data. And so when I was doing my PhD in Australia, we kind of did some comparisons between these two sets of data to see how valuable and how iNaturalist data might be complementary or useful in marine settings. So I mentioned this a second ago, but here are just some random observations of mine. And when I take these observations, generally I'm interested in that fiery skipper, right? When I upload that to iNaturalist, I am thinking about that fiery skipper for my list, and like maybe that's a new butterfly that I've never seen in that county because I'm a lister. But in each one of these photos, there's additional information, which we call secondary data. And so here it's an interaction, here it's mating behavior, another interaction, predator-prey event here, another predator-prey event here. So there's a lot of data that's existing. But the question is like, what can you use those data for? And so for this question, we were wondering if you can quantify habitat information from iNaturalist photographs. And so this was led by an undergraduate student who came over. She was a US based student, but she came over to University of New South Wales, Sydney, where I was doing my PhD, and we worked with a small team of us to basically answer this question and see what was possible. Because when people submit observations to iNaturalist of fishes, there are information in the background, right? So here's 4 examples of iNaturalist, and you can kind of see some potential information on the habitat, right? But here's Reef Life Survey, which part of the kind of set objective of Reef Life Survey is to actually get some data of the marine environment in terms of habitat. And so we were interested in comparing these two. And so first, she went through a lot of photos manually and just looked at the usability, right? So across we gathered images across 6 different sites in Eastern Australia. And on average, across those 6 sites, just more than 75% of them were quote usable, right? A lot of them some of them had to be thrown out because there was just water in the background. They were blurry, dark, only sand. But in general, more than 75% of the photos had a usable score. And then we really simply took the occurrence frequency for these different kind of macro habitat values from Reef Life Survey occurrence frequency and iNaturalist occurrence frequency, those images from each of those sites. So each one of these points represents the habitat and site. And we found a really strong correlation between the two, right? So this is like pretty decent evidence that in general, you can kind of estimate that the habitat frequency at this macro level of marine environments using iNaturalist photographs. Now, this was manually done, so it's still time consuming and expensive, but there's a lot of photos on iNaturalist and an increasing amount of photos of fish that have some of the secondary data in the background that I don't think are fully being capitalized on yet. The second question was wondering if we can estimate species richness from iNaturalist, and comparing again at some of these same sites across Eastern Australia to ask the question of how does the species richness generated from Reef Life Survey. Again, part of the objective of Reef Life Survey is to kind of monitor marine environments, including fish and diversity and habitat, compared to iNaturalist, where there is not really that objective. People just go and preferentially sample and submit whatever fish they think are cool. And so how do those two go together? And so here, each pie chart shows the number of fish species for both. Blue is iNaturalist, and then orange is Reef Life Survey. And so you can see it, and the size of the pie chart is the number of observations from iNaturalist. And so you can see for this really popular dive site called Shelly Beach, you have a lot of data and a lot of fish species that are only observed from iNaturalist. Quite a few from both as well, but a relatively small proportion that are only observed from Reef Life Survey. And you can see similar patterns across these different sites. Here's a similar way to look at the data. The previous slide was simply kind of aggregated across all time. And here's how it is through time. And I think this is important because iNaturalist is increasing, right? So more and more people are submitting data. So in time, you should get an increasing number of fish species that are being generated. And so here again is the Shelly Beach, which is this like really popular dive site. And this is just the total species richness. The blue is iNaturalist and the orange is Reef Life Survey. You can see this cumulative increase where it just kind of keeps ticking up and up using iNaturalist. But you can see this, more or less accumulation using Reef Life Survey. And you can see that similar pattern for all of these sites, right? Where you kind of get some level of accumulation. But here's this Oak Park is a good example because there's not really iNaturalist data going back that far. But once it comes online, you still get this complementary data in terms of different fish species that aren't being observed via Reef Life Survey. And then we looked at certain fish species to see if there was different characteristics that could predict kind of whether or not it would be more commonly observed in Reef Life Survey versus iNaturalist. And I won't go into that in detail, but the blue is iNaturalist and the orange is Reef Life Survey. And you can kind of look at the paper for some more of those details. And so these two are just, again, a little bit of a digression into some marine work that I've been involved with in the past. And I know it was Australia focused, but I think a lot of this would probably pertain to parts of the US as well. And I'd love to chat with anybody that's interested in thinking about some of these questions or are using the data in this way already. And one of the main points we made in this paper on the species richness was that iNaturalist complements the structured surveys of reef fish, right? There's no part that I want to be very clear that I don't think it replaces, because you need some of these different strategies of sampling to get the whole picture of species biodiversity. The last thing I wanted to talk about was environmental impact statements, and so the use of citizen science in policy relevant documents. This is a paper that was published I guess early this year, but late last year, called Citizen Science is a Valuable Tool for Environmental Review, published in Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment. And this looked at NEPA. I'm sure in this audience, probably everybody is familiar with NEPA, but just to be safe, NEPA is one of the most critical pieces that we have in terms of federal land mitigation. It involves science and the public and federal decision making, requires environmental review of potential impacts of proposed federal action. And there are three different levels of analysis: environmental impact statements, environmental assessment, and then exclusion. And so any piece of federal land that is going to undergo something, whether it's full on development or simple fixes to a bridge over a estuary, right? Like that has to go through this NEPA permitting process. And so I was curious how much citizen science data are making it into these documents. And so we used a NEPA Access database that was developed by some colleagues at University of Arizona that had kind of housed all the environmental impact statements between 2012 and 2022. We searched those with the following keywords: citizen science, community science, eBird, and iNaturalist. And we searched over 1,300 documents, of which 228 ended up being used in the analysis. Here's a visualization of where those documents came from, over the entire US, with some variation, mostly in California and quite a few out west, some up in New York, relatively few up in different, the Midwest and those parts of the United States. And here are the environmental impact statements based on the different agencies that use these data. U.S. Army Corps of Engineer was kind of out in front, but followed by Forest Service and BLM. NOAA just made the top couple, so I figured I'd circle that for this talk. And so for each one of these environmental impact statements, we qualitatively coded them. And what that means is we had a priori definitions, and I'll go through each of these. The 4 definitions were nondescript, suggested, indirect, and direct. And then for each one of the environmental impact statements, we classified them into one of those categories. And so nondescript refers to the use of citizen science methods, but it was like kind of unclear. They might mention an iNaturalist walk, for instance. So we're not entirely sure like how that was actually being used or if it was being used meaningfully. Suggested was quite a few that would recommend the use of citizen science to kind of monitor in the future, right? To get more data in the future after said implementation. And so, we'll use online citizen science bird monitoring for continued surveillance of occurrence, right? So there's an example of something like that. Indirect was, we're not really interested in that. They cited eBird or iNaturalist, but in a very general way that has no real bearing on the actual policy relevance itself. So, red knot are generally restricted to coasts during winter and occurs primarily along the coast during migration. Cite eBird, right? So something very kind of generic that is indirectly related to citizen science and the policy. And then the one that we're kind of like most interested in is this direct usage, right? The actual usage of citizen science data to have some implied bearing on the decision of these policy environmental impact statements. And there was 2 different types: presence and absence. And so in eBird, there are 687 records of 969 outside of flycatcher individuals on this national forest. And I will come back to absence in a second. So here's the trends through time from 2012 to 2022. By 2022, about 40% of environmental impact statements we looked at are using or mentioning citizen science at some level, right? And so most of them are direct. You can see here, direct is the green. And so the majority are direct, but you can see this generally increasing trend through time in the usage of citizen science within environmental impact statements under NEPA. So here's the kind of all 4 different types and what the numbers ended up being. So 64% were direct usage, 19% were indirect, 4% were nondescript, where we couldn't kind of quite tell what was being meant. And then 20% of documents actually suggested the use of citizen science data, or citizen science in the future to monitor potentially. And the breakdown between eBird and iNaturalist, so 87% used eBird and 6% used iNaturalist. I think that that's probably going to change through time. I think iNaturalist is just recently gaining quite a bit of traction in terms of the data that they're generating and the different taxonomic coverage that they're generating. So I think that those numbers I think this number would increase a bit in the future. Now, I wanted to return to absence because 12% of all EISs within that direct category used no citing of a species as evidence of absence of that species, right? So here's a quote from one of them. No records of Arkansas river shiner have been submitted to iNaturalist from within or close to the landscape analysis area. And I don't know how else to put this, but this is a little bit scary, right? Because if you go to iNaturalist and look for Arkansas river shiner, there's one record. And these documents are not necessarily accounting for statistically or otherwise the sampling effort to make these absence claims. And I think this is absolutely worthy of future discussion. Thinking about thinking about how these data can be used in the future in terms of NEPA and other policy relevant approaches. Generally our results show increasing use in the future potential of citizen science in environmental review. And I think there's a lot of, part of this paper was just raising some discussions. And even myself, who I consider myself a pretty heavy user of iNaturalist, I'm personally conflicted because, in one regard, if you tell me that site A is under potential development, I want to go out and document everything I can there. And that's the conservationist in me. But then if you tell me that the possibility of somebody just coming along and analyzing data and writing a report for it, environmental impact statement, and they're getting paid a lot of money to do so, I'm not entirely sure, right? So I think there's a lot of avenue to think about how these data are used in environmental review, how agencies interact with volunteers, and where and how, who owns the data. I think there's a lot to unpack here. And part of the purpose of this paper was just to, I guess, raise the alarm of hey, we should start thinking about this a little bit more. And so I think we need to consider the extent that participants are willing to share data, as I just mentioned. Think about understanding of the data from an appropriate statistical analysis perspective, and ensure that, as I mentioned, a lot of mitigation and such relies on NEPA and other policy relevant legislature. And I think we need to be really careful about how these conclusions are scientifically sound. And this project was focused on NEPA in part because that was kind of the easiest to get our hands on because there's this database that already existed. I'm really interested to know about state level permitting, or even county level permitting, or even municipality level permitting, especially places along the coast in terms of marine environment. I think there's a lot of potential research to unpack here and understand how and when and if these data are being used. Nevertheless, just to kind of wrap it up a little bit, so citizen science is becoming more commonly used. I think even just when I started publishing in this space, I think the trust and validity and respect that these data are getting in terms of the biodiversity research and policy, I think I've seen, grow pretty tremendously. It involves the public and EISs, and so that's a good thing. Thinking about how and when, as I mentioned, is really important for the future. It's increasingly contributing to scientific research. Similar trends between articles that use iNaturalist and iNaturalist observations. And I think coming back to that initial talking point is getting the people involved really has a lot of value for science in a bigger picture perspective. And one more final point. I think iNaturalist is only as good as the community, right? It's a very community-driven approach and a community-driven platform. So we wrote this paper a few years ago that basically is just outlining the benefits of contributing to the platform as an identifier. And I only throw this in because I imagine a lot of the audience probably are able to identify fish, and I have a lot of fishes that I've seen that are uploaded and are still not research grade. And I'm sure that some of the people in the audience can change that, and that maybe be a little selfish. But generally, I think that that's the bottleneck, right? We need a lot of people with skills that have the ability to ID stuff to actually ID stuff, because when that happens, it's more experts join iNaturalist, more observations are identified. You get this kind of teaching between citizen scientists and experts. The citizen scientists make better identifications, and the computer vision model becomes better. And then the quality of data iNaturalist improves, right? More things go to research grade, more things go to GBIF, and ultimately more data ends up being used in biodiversity research and policy. So, like I said, I like to try to think about here this biodiversity data. It's definitely increasing. How and when can we use it, 10, 15, 20 years from now, I think is where I really would like to think about. And so if anybody has thoughts or wants to get interested in this from a marine perspective, I'd certainly be happy to chat, after this at some point. All right. And I felt bad because there wasn't much fish stuff. So I had to at least throw a few more fish in at the end. So yeah, any questions?
Awesome. Thank you for your presentation, Corey. And then the questions are rolling in. So let me pull up the first one for us. This might be too specific, but I'm looking to find a centralized database to submit eDNA and acoustic samples from citizen science research collected via an ocean conservation travel group. Any idea if this exists?
That's a good question. It is fairly specific. Acoustic samples, I mean, there's a lot of different places for those, including iNaturalist. Assuming you mean like acoustic samples identifiable, like as in an organism is identifiable. eDNA, there is a colleague who's there's an IUCN working group that I'm a part of that kind of, and a subgroup that focuses on citizen science. And I know that she's done some space in that. So if you email me, I could potentially respond to that a little bit better.
Okay, thank you. Our next question. Any good published examples of applying citizen science in developing municipal biodiversity strategies? I had a longer comment in chat before I saw the Q&A tab.
I mean, I think this is a good question, and I think this was part of the point I was trying to get at. I think a lot of this is very much in the gray area of I guess the question is published examples. I'm not sure. I'm sure there are some, but I don't know of many. I know anecdotally that this is being done, but so I feel like I'm fumbling that question. It's a good question though.
All good. The next question. There has been a recent push to use citizen science to estimate abundance in fish species or amount of catch. However, there are concerns about the non-random nature of the sampling. Is this a feasible or defensible use of such data?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a concern, right? Like this is part of the thing, and you have to account for detectability. This is where I think there's a rapidly growing field of integrated population model and integrated data. And so my answer here is really pushing towards this integrated data, and I tried to make that point about the species richness comparison. Is it's not just iNaturalist data. I think you need some of the ground truth detectability estimates from, be it the traditional transect surveys that are expensive and time consuming. But if you can anchor those with the iNaturalist data or citizen science data that has much more generally broader spatial applicability, then I think that's like the sweet spot where we are headed, hopefully, in the next couple of years. And a lot of these methods are being developed quite rapidly.
Thank you. The next question we have, in your example of marine fish in Australia and comparing two data sets, did you also look into REDMap as a source for citizen science information on marine fish distributions?
We discussed it. I do not remember exactly how we did or did not look into it. That project was based on a project ran through the Australian Museum called Australasian Fishes, which basically is like an iNaturalist project to aggregate all fishes, and they're all kind of like within Australia, and they're all very well identified. So I'm just giving non-answer after non-answer. These are tough questions.
Our next question, What was your sample size of EISs, and why has citizen science been more accepted over time beyond the technology advancements?
Yeah, our sample size was, I'm going to zoom back so I don't misspeak. We looked at 1,300 documents from 2012 to 2022, of which 228 were used in the analysis. So we looked at a lot, but then 228 kind of met our criteria with the keyword searches. Why has citizen science been more accepted? Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's more of a qualitative observation that I feel like I have made throughout my career. Is just like it used to be everybody would just question everything, and there's always biases. And I think part of it is just a lot of work has been done in the literature to make these comparisons between citizen science and non-citizen science data to understand kind of where the biases are and understand how you can account for those biases from a statistical perspective. So I think there's a lot of work that's being done from that perspective and just more trust, right? Like really cool stuff has been answered with these data, and as more people are using them, I think it's just takes a while to build trust, I guess is my short answer.
Okay, thank you for your answer. And I did want to point out, just so we have it for the recording as well, regarding the question about eDNA data, someone put into the chat that GBIF and OBIS are starting to accept eDNA biodiversity data. You can find more information on their websites, gbif.org and obis.org. And then our next question. Great presentation. Although there may be challenges and limitations, has there been work with utilizing citizen science for marine mammal wildlife population?
Yeah, there definitely has been. I don't know about broad scale, like kind of species distribution modeling, but a lot of that there's like many different forms of citizen science. I really focused on kind of the biodiversity, species distribution, kind of like where, what, when species are. But there's been quite a few Zooniverse projects, which is like a whole nother flavor of citizen science that's like media based. And I know that there's projects, for instance, classifying individuals using photos of tails of whales and such. So yes, definitely, and they're out there. And there's been some shark stuff, although I know that's not a mammal, but yes. And like I said, please feel free to email me, and happy to have any chats. Yeah, at any point.
Sounds good. Thank you. Okay. Oh, and then it was put in chat. There are several specific marine mammal programs on citizenscience.gov that you can check out. Thank you. All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much for your presentation today, Corey. And thank you, Rebecca, for organizing this event. Audience, thank you for attending, and we hope to see you all at our next library seminar. Thank you for attending, and have a great rest of the day.